Hey guys, I'm back. Thank you so much for your support on my last video about Israel, what my thoughts are on Israel, who I believe Israel is. I had a lot of really good feedback on that video. I'm really appreciative of the things that you guys shared, and I'm ready to get into my next topic. As you can see by the title, that is more specifically about me as an individual and about Black Americans. The title of the video is Am I Hebrew? So let's get right into this discussion. I have notes, so I will be looking down at my notepad. If you see me looking up and down, that's why I have a lot of material here that I want to get into. Also, I have my computer here with some information that I wanted to share. So I'll be reading, quoting from sites, and I'll put the links and the information for those sites in the video and in the description bar so that you can reference those for yourself as well. Also, I am likely going to have to use my glasses. If I don't, great, but I'm not imagining that I won't because I have a lot of notes and a lot to read. So I'll probably be taking them on and off. Bear with me. So again, this is the second video in the series. The first video was called Who is Israel and What Do I Think About It? Please check that out if you haven't watched it. It's really worth watching. It gives you some background about the topics that I'm going to talk about today. Today I'm going to be talking about my identity, who I am, whether or not I believe I'm a Hebrew. But that video talks about the subject kind of in more broad terms. Okay, so it talks about Israel specifically and what I believe about Israel. Okay, so give it a look. Check this one out. I'm sure that you're going to find what I have to say to be very interesting. And again, I want to preface this by saying that it is not my intention to cause offense. I realize that people are going to disagree with me and that some people may find what I have to share offensive because they believe something that's opposite. My goal isn't to be offensive. I hope that you can hear what I'm saying in the spirit that it's given. I pray that you're able to receive it. But really, I would love to have people who are questioning or asking questions about this belief system to just listen to what I have to say about it. And you can form your opinions, but you definitely need to be able to research and think about it. And hopefully there are people who come across this video who are in that process, and you will be able to use some of what I share to help you in your decision-making process. Maybe there are people who are not in the decision-making process and are just curious about the subject. Maybe there are those who are very deeply involved in this belief system already and haven't considered some of the things that I have to share, and maybe that will kind of stir some thoughts in you. Either way, I pray that this information is a blessing and is helpful to people. So let's get into it. The question that I've raised is, am I a Hebrew? Do I believe that there are Black people who are of Hebrew descent? Absolutely. I absolutely believe there are. For instance, the Lemba in Southern Africa show a clear direct descent to the Hebrews of the Bible. What I reject is the narrative that the transatlantic slave trade is foretold in Scripture and that all the descendants of those slaves are of Hebrew descent. There's a lot of misinformation given that tries to uphold this idea, and people try to use the Bible, specifically Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 68, to support that. So let's look at it and kind of look at why I think it's not really a verse that supports this concept. The verse says, "The Lord will send you back in ships to Egypt on a journey I said you should never make again. Therefore you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you." And because this community really prefers to use the King James Version, we can read the King James Version of it. "And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you." There's so much in that verse that doesn't happen or that isn't specifically relevant, but I want to talk about one particular point. The reference is being made to being taken back to Egypt in ships, right? And so the implication is that you're going back to someplace that you've already been. Well, the Americas are not a place that the former slaves had ever been. They hadn't been there and then been taken back once slavery occurred. So that really doesn't fit. Also, the reference is being made to Egypt. They're going back to Egypt. It's not symbolic. It literally says Mitzrayim, Egypt, that's where they're going. The point there is that they're being taken back from the promised land to Egypt. And that is not actually an unreasonable expectation. They did walk from Egypt to Israel, but there were shipping lanes in the time, Phoenician shipping lanes, for instance, that shipped goods and merchandise back and forth between Mediterranean world, back and forth around the Mediterranean world. And there were ports along the coast of what we call Israel today that also shipped down into Egypt and came back There was also a port in the area of the Red Sea that would have shipped things back and forth. So this text, which refers to people being taken back to Egypt in ships, wouldn't have been far-fetched. It wouldn't have been an unusual thing for that day. Yes, people walked, but there were also trade routes that utilized shipping on sea. So this text referring to being taken to the Americas just absolutely does not fit. Obviously, I'm referring to what we call the Americas today. Again, the text references going back to Egypt. It references slavery, but those things happened during the time, during the biblical period in Egypt, in Israel. I mean, no disrespect when I say this, but Black Americans do not have the corner on the market of slavery. We're not the only people who've experienced slavery. We have experienced it, but this reference isn't being made to us. Okay, there are people outside of our context who have experienced slavery. It's one of the markers of trauma that we actually associate this reference with ourselves. It's not unusual that people will do that. We'll kind of take a reference and say, yes, this is what happened to us because we've suffered a similar trauma. But this isn't about us. It's about somebody else, somebody very specific, the people of Israel. Okay, but just because it's about them and it's something similar that happened doesn't mean it's also about us. Let's talk about the idea of fake Jews, because that's also an idea that's been presented to me as to why the people who are white, who say that they are of Hebrew or biblical descent, obviously cannot be the true people of Israel. And one of the strongest arguments I've been presented with is that they are Khazars, of Khazar descent, who were a group of people that were converted en masse, and that all the people who are white now are their descendants, who are white and Jews are their descendants. So let's talk about migration patterns and population movements. In times of great distress, populations move, right? That's been happening since as long as there were people on earth. People will shift in times of war, in times of famine, in times of drought. They move around because they're trying to ensure their survival and the survival of their people. This is the same thing that has happened with Israel over time. They have moved to different places in the world when they've had to, largely due to persecution, but they've moved continually. So the implication is that, like I said, white people who are Jewish can't be true Jews. They are the descendants of Khazars. So let's talk about the diaspora of the Jews. Specifically, let's talk about biblical events in 70 AD, and then again in 133 or 135 AD with the Kochva Revolt, right? You have a horrible, horrible period. First of all, you have the Roman Empire ruling in Israel over an extended period of time, a very long period of time. And then after a while, there is rebellion and revolt against them. So once in 70 AD and then again in 135 AD, you have rebellion against the Romans, and ultimately you have first the Jews leaving, and then you have them being expelled. Okay, 70 AD, 135 AD. So what happens is that the people en masse begin to leave. They leave because there's persecution. They leave because there's a siege. They leave because there's oppression. And they go into other parts of the Roman Empire. They also go down into Africa, some of them do, which is being controlled, the northern parts of Africa are being controlled by the Romans at this time as well. They go east toward India. They go north into Europe as well. And again, they're not thinking of these places as Asia or Africa or Europe, right? They are going into what they know of as the Roman Empire, and some of them are going out into the fringes further east, like India. But for the most part, they're going into known regions. Once they get there, they're continuing to practice their faith because that's the only thing, that's the primary thing that ties them together as a community, their faith and their heritage. While they're there, they come across converts to their faith, or people who they're interacting with convert to their faith, and they marry with people in those communities who have adopted their faith, right? Their Jewish faith. They're continuing to practice their beliefs, their Judaism, but at the same time, they're marrying people who have adopted that faith, or who you maybe adopted it before they got there, having heard about it previously, or adopted as a result of interacting with them. And so you begin to see intermarriage with locals who have adopted the faith, so also take on the identity, the cultural heritage of Israel. So let's fast forward, right? As Western culture develops and grows, the people maintain their cultural identity. And so you get to see, not actually just in the West, but across the world, you get to see many people who share the same DNA that can be traced back to Israel, to Israelites, but they're in different parts of the world and they look completely different. In India, in parts of Africa, in Europe. Those people, though, all share the same genetic coding because they all are descended from the people of Israel. I want to read a quote to you because I thought it was excellent, and it talks about this He does a better job than I do of addressing it. So I'm going to read it to you. The text is from an article in an online publication called Forward. Okay. And it's just in their culture section of their publication. I'll include the link, so you're welcome to read it in its entirety. And here is the passage, and it's kind of lengthy, so just bear with me. So I'm starting mid-paragraph, okay? And the author of the article is Jewish, so I'm going to be reading it from his perspective. The author is quoting or is referring to another source where a person has done a study on Jewish descent and DNA, and the person is named Ostra. Here's where the quote begins. It's stamped on our DNA. As Ostra explains in fascinating detail, threads of Jewish ancestry link the sizable Jewish communities of North Africa and Europe to Yemenite and other Middle Eastern Jews who have relocated to Israel, as well as to the Black Lemba of Southern Africa and to India's Cochin Jews. Why then are Jews so different looking, usually sharing the characteristics of the surrounding populations? Think of red-haired Jews, Jews with blue eyes, or the Black Jews of Africa. Like any cluster, a genetic term Ostra uses in place of the more inflammatory race, Jews throughout history moved around and fooled around, although mixing occurred comparatively infrequently until recent decades. Although there are identifiable gene variations that are common among Jews, we are not a pure race. The time machine of our genes may show that most Jews have a shared ancestry that traces back to ancient Palestine. But like all of humanity, Jews are mutts. About 80% of Jewish males and 50% of Jewish females trace their ancestry back to the Middle East. The rest entered the, quote, Jewish gene pool through conversion or intermarriage. Those who did intermarry often left the faith in a generation or two, in effect, pruning the Jewish genetic tree. But many converts became interwoven into the Jewish genealogical line. Reflect on the iconic convert, the biblical Ruth, who married Boaz and became the great-grandmother of King David. She began as an outsider, but you don't get much more Jewish than the bloodline of King David. And the source is forward.com. It's in their culture section, and again, the link will be in the description bar for you. So the author's point is that there are definitely conversions, but there's also a genetic link that you will see to people who are of Jewish descent, right back to biblical Palestine, to Israel. So people who are white and of Jewish descent who come from Europe, many of them do carry the Jewish marker, that Jewish genetic marker. Just saying that they can't be of Jewish descent because they're white is a complete fallacy. And there's not really good evidence to support that or substantiate that. The ancient Hebrews of the Bible, they were Middle Eastern. They weren't black. They were not white. They were Middle Eastern. They looked more like Arabs. When we look at Arab people today and we see their brown skin, that's what the Jews looked like. So when you look at Arab peoples, you can see a darker skin tone, clearly not blonde, not blue-eyed, not European, right? But also not African. And so the people of the biblical period should not be referred to as Northeast Africans, because there's not a Northeast Africa in the Fertile Crescent, which is the area where Abraham and his descendants are from. The area is known as Mesopotamia, which means the land between the rivers, those two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Okay? And they're Mesopotamian in heritage and in background. They're not African, they're not white. So while I will not say that the people of Israel during the time of the Bible were white, because they absolutely were not, they also were not black. They were Middle Eastern. They were of Mesopotamian descent. So I'm not a Hebrew, and neither are most Americans who are descended from former slaves, or people in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in Southern America, who have ancestors who were once slaves. None of us are specifically, and because of the transatlantic slave trade, descended from Hebrews. It is possible that we may have people of Israelite descent in our ancestry because of human mixing and communities coming together, but not as a result of the slave trade. It's not a truth that slaves came over as one of the punishments laid out in Deuteronomy 28 and as one of the exiles that the Israelites were told they would experience because of disobedience to God. That's not our story, and that's not our heritage. That's not our background. So as I stated in my previous video, what is Israel and what do I think of them? I mentioned a key issue, and that issue, and I'm going to read this because I want to be very specific here. That issue is the issue of brokenness, and that people are continually searching for purpose and meaning, right? So all people are looking for identity, for purpose, and for meaning. Add to that mix of people who have been and continue to be traumatized, and you have fertile ground for misinformation being abused and embraced. We know that individuals can suffer identity crises, right? But so can communities. Now, by and large, people within that community will try to find a way to manage, right, to cope. And so you have that happening a lot with the former slaves. They gravitate toward religion. They gravitate toward something to fill the void, to bring healing and restoration. And religion, or looking for a faith system, does that for them. But you also have, and they find that answer in the Bible, right? And ultimately in the teachings of Christianity. But misinterpretation and misassociation by some people has allowed them to claim the identity of Israel and the Jews, where that identity doesn't exist. Black people, incidentally, aren't the first people to do this. There have been other groups around the world who have done it. In Europe, specifically, not in Europe, I'm sorry, in England, there's a group who identifies themselves as the 12 tribes of Israel. They are white. They see themselves as being the 12 tribes of Israel. It goes back to this conversation of, in my previous video, of misunderstanding the idea of Israel's chosenness, that they are loved by God and chosen, and more special or more loved because of that. Therefore, we crave to have that same identity, to identify with that specific people, right? To be that people because God loves them more, and so I must be. That would make me special. That would give me a secure identity to be the one He loves the most, right? And especially if you've been abused or traumatized, that is very appealing. Well, this special identity gives validity to our lives. It explains our experiences. It even gives validity to our suffering if we can have some reason for it. And that our specialness makes us unique and sets us apart. And it maybe is even, our suffering is even a result of us disobeying God because we're so special to Him. He's having us experience these things because we disobeyed. So there's a connection there that's unhealthy. And it's a need to find meaning and identity. That doesn't mean that it's right or that it's true. This is what Hebrew Israelite teaching does. It's not done with any kind of intentional malice, but it's still teaching or taking the identity of somebody else and embracing it. And it's dangerous. It's not healthy. Let's think back to the early 20th century and Black Americans. There's an upsurge in Blacks finding their voice, finding identity, and looking for ways to address the ills within our community, right? The things that have happened to us as a people. And so you see lots of different things happening. Some people are moving toward religion. There's nationalism, Pan-Africanism happening. People are looking for identity and trying to search for it in different ways. One of the ways that that's expressed is through adopting a nationalist kind of approach to things. And so the Nation of Islam, like Black Muslims, what was called Black Hebrews back then, but is now called Hebrew Israelites, all of those things grow out of that context of Black people, in America at least, looking for a solid identity and being able to claim a healthy and solid identity. And one way that people do that is through religion. And I know that Hebrew Israelites would like to not have the term religion associated with them, but any belief system that that claims a higher power, like the Most High, and that teaches doctrine and lifestyle, that is religion, right? It teaches you how to live, what practices you should abide by according to the teachings of your deity, being the Most High, for Hebrew Israelites. So that is a religion. That's the basic definition of religion. When you have a belief system that guides lifestyle practices, that guides spiritual beliefs. Okay, so I know people resist that term, but it's a religion. And both of these movements, they seek to empower and help Black people, which is not a bad thing. But the method is not healthy. It even presents its own myth of the bad guy. And in this case, it's the white man, who conveniently is also the one who's been oppressing us historically. So there is this ability to find the villain within the religion and within Hebrew Israelite teachings, at least in some communities. That villain is Esau, who's the white man. Has absolutely no validity biblically. There's no way to make the association between Esau, who would have been more in the Middle East, in the areas of Jordan and going east into the Arabian Peninsula, and white people who are in Europe, which is way over here somewhere. But there's a desperate need to name a villain and to identify him in your text, in your holy text. And that's that's just what's happening there. It's a really obvious attempt. I don't think, again, like I said, that it's malicious at all, but, well, it is malicious, but I don't think that it's intentionally deceptive. I don't think anybody's trying to deceive or create something. I think it's genuinely believed, but it's still unhealthy. It's completely scientifically erroneous. There's no grounds for it. And it's one of those responses to trauma, to try to find healthy identity, to try to find it through religion, to try to find it through national identity. So again, the Black nationalist movement, and I'm going to read you what I wrote here because I think I worded it very well in writing, and I want to stick to this specifically. The Black nationalist movement seeks to give an identity to its people, erroneously interpreting God or the Most High's relationship with Israel as one of favoritism and preference above any other people. Therefore, it is taken, and a whole teaching is crafted around it, even identifying bad guys, white people, the very ones who enslaved our ancestors in the first place. The teaching, it doesn't hold up to much scrutiny, and that's why you'll have people either shutting down the conversation, out shouting over you. If you've ever seen the street preachers, Hebrew Israelite street teachers, they won't allow people to speak and say anything that actually refutes their teachings. And there are people who have been in the community and taught in the community who have been told that these are the things they're taught to do. You know, they're taught to shout people down. Don't give them a chance to speak. It may be that they present things that they don't have an answer for. So they use intimidation, shutting down the conversation, not allowing people to ask questions. If you ask questions and push back, then you're not being respectful, not honoring the leaders, not honoring their teachings, not honoring their knowledge. And all of that is unhealthy. When you have a community that doesn't allow for that doesn't allow for scrutiny, for scrutinizing the teachings and asking about them and even challenging them, then that system can't hold up. It's not solid, it's not stable if it can't hold up to scrutiny. And that's one of the primary tenets of a destructive religious practice or a cult. When they don't allow you to ask questions, when they shut down any conversation, isolation, keeping you from relationships with family and friends, that's another conversation altogether. But those are specific signs, right, of destructive religious practices. One of them being discourse and dialogue not being allowed, unless it's within the teachings of the community and it upholds the teachings of the community. Another example is, not being allowed to use any outside sources. Like anytime when I bring up my educational background, when I bring up the things I've learned, all of that is from their perspective. It's from outside, and so it can't be trusted. It's been manipulated. You've been deceived. You've been told this stuff by them. So of course, that's what they're going to say. Like that's the presentation you get whenever you bring up anything that contradicts the teachings of the community. Well, right there, the conversation's shut down. So you have no room for a conversation. You have no room for discourse. That is another example of an unhealthy practice. There's not room for conversation. I will say this, there have been quite a few people from within the community who have reached out to me, who have shared their thoughts with me, who have asked me to consider scriptures in a very polite way. They haven't been disrespectful or rude. There have been those who have been, but there have been a good number of people who have reached out to me, probably within this past year, who have been very respectful and very polite, and I really, really appreciate their tone. I'm very grateful for that. And I have researched those scriptures. I have spent time looking into it. I actually considered doing a master's, not a master's, but a PhD on this community years ago. So I've done research and I've learned about the ideas and the teachings. And I've read the scriptures as well. I've looked into it. I just think that they're inadequate to support the ideas and the beliefs of the community, and that ultimately they don't bear out. They're not substantial. The last thing I want to talk about is the suffix ish. And I'm not using it in the way that people in modern slang in 2017 are using it. I want to talk about it in terms of the suffix ish that we put on the end of a noun. This argument I have a really hard time taking seriously, but because so many people have presented it to me, I'm going to address it. So ish is used in modern speech, right, when we're referring to something being like something. But the term actually, a really quick search online will show you that the term just means belonging to a certain thing, right? That's why we've derived this other meaning that we ascribe to it today. But really it means belonging to something. When you're talking about people, groups, and communities, it means belonging to that community. That's why we use the term Danish, Swedish, right? People from Denmark are Danish. People from Sweden are Swedish. People from Ireland are Irish. Ish is just one of the markers that we use. It's a suffix that we use in English to denote a community. Jewish works that way as well, because the Jewish people were a tribe or a group of people. And when you wanted to talk about how that people is connected, the word in English, we use ish to refer to them. All of these communities that I've just mentioned, Danish people, Swedish people, Irish people, we're talking about tribal groups and communities historically, right? Who eventually coalesced into a nation. Now, in modern times, the Jewish people did not coalesce into a nation because they were in other parts of the world. Today, they have formed a nation, some years ago, some decades ago, in 1948, and we call that nation Israel. Rather than use the name of the people, the modern name, they used the historical name of the people, which was Israel. So there's really nothing super mystical about that. It's just the name that came from the biblical period, instead of using the word Jew or Jewish. We'll talk about the word Jew and where that came from, just to give you a little mini history lesson, okay? The people of Israel during the intertestamental period, which is the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, they are exiled. So you have a history going on here. There were two kingdoms in Israel after Solomon dies. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, right? The northern kingdom is the northern 10 tribes. The southern kingdom are Benjamin and Judah. The northern kingdom are all the other ones. The northern kingdom in 722 BC is exiled by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians bring in all kinds of different people who then integrate with those of the 10 tribes who are left there. You get a mixed community of people who the southern tribes don't really want to have anything to do with. So the southern tribes are Judah and Benjamin, collectively known as Judah. That's why you'll see, especially in the prophets, references to the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. It's talking about the northern and southern kingdoms. So the northern kingdom is gone, right? They're exiled by the Assyrians. Southern kingdom is still there for a good bit longer. And eventually the Babylonians come along and they conquer the southern kingdom of Judah. And they exile mainly the leadership. They leave the peasantry, but they exile large numbers of people who are in leadership and in high positions and take them to Babylon. While in Babylon, those people are known as Yehud, which is Judah, the southern tribe. They call them by the name of their kingdom. That's how the people are identified. They're living there for a good number of years. Eventually, some of the ones who were exiled and their descendants go back into Israel, into the land. And so now they're back. They still have that term associated with them, Yehud. They fill up the land. They don't just go down to the southern kingdom. They fill up the whole land. And so they're living all over. They try to avoid the Samaritans, who are that mixed people, but for the most part, they fill up the place. The Samaritans kind of congregate in one particular area, and the northern and southern kingdom becomes occupied by the Jews, by Yehud, who has now left Babylon and come back in. They're identified as Yehud by the Greeks, who conquer by the Persians, who conquer after the Babylonians, and then by the Greeks, who conquer after the Persians, and then by the Romans, who conquer after the Greeks. They're identified as Yehud all throughout that period of time. Then you get to the exile during the period of the Romans, when they go out into the Roman world, and some into Africa and some out east. And while they're in those areas, they still retain that name, right? They still retain the name Yehud in the Roman Empire. Fast forward to 20th century, 19th century, 20th century, and you're dealing with different groups, different language groups in Europe, and German is one of them. And they refer to these people as Juden. They don't have that sound, the y that's in Hebrew. They don't use it. They say j instead. And so instead of calling them Yehud, they call them Juden, right? They call them Jews. And so once that translates into English or transmits into English, it becomes Jewish. You're welcome. So I've said all of that to say that no, I am not a Hebrew. I am not a Jew. I am a Gentile. I'm one of the communities of people who was not the biblical people of Israel that's designated, that God interacts with. But God had a specific plan from the start to use that people, and I hate to use the term use, but to have that people interact with the world, to tell the world about him and draw people back to relationship with him. And that's exactly what happened, and that's why I'm in relationship with God today. There is nothing super special or better about being one of the peoples of the Bible. There's just not. I mean, it's great, but that doesn't make you any better or any more favored or loved by God. There's nothing wrong with being a Gentile and not having been one of the people groups, the people group that God chose in the Bible to share himself with the world. God did not choose that one people group to isolate them, make them better, and say he was going to bring his wrath and punishment on the rest of the world, but pull us out and make us separate and special, which is also what some people believe. He did not do that, right? So yes, I do consider myself to be a Gentile. Yes, I consider myself to be a believer in Jesus. I use the term Christian. Some people are uncomfortable with that term, and sometimes, honestly, I am too, because of how it's been portrayed to the world and how many Christians have behaved. But I am a follower of Jesus, the Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach. I do follow him. I do believe his teachings. I do not consider myself Jewish. I do not consider myself a Hebrew. I do not consider myself a Messianic Jew. And that's going to be the subject of my next video in this series. I'll be talking about Messianic Judaism, what it is and what it is not, and who is a part of that community and who is not a part of that community. Ultimately, though, we're all followers of Jesus, of Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. I hope that you learned something. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your views. And please let me know if there are other topics you want me to talk about. I've been wanting to talk about this topic for a long time, and I'm glad that I finally gotten a chance to do it. Please thumbs up the video. Please share it. I don't mind at all. In fact, I would be happy for you to share it with people who have questions about this topic, with people who are considering, who are wondering about it. Please, please, please share it with them. I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you so much for your time, guys. I appreciate your support, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.